It was a bright and sunny afternoon in the city, and the streets were filled with people enjoying the warmth of the day. The historic area, where the Royal Guard stood watch, had always been a popular spot for tourists and locals alike. People would often stop to take photos, admire the grand architecture, and watch the soldiers in their traditional uniforms standing motionless in their posts. For most, it was a moment of respect and admiration for the centuries-old traditions of the city. But today, things were about to take a very different turn. A woman named Karen, known for her entitled attitude, was strolling through the area with her young child. She was already frustrated because of the crowd. The heat of the day didn't help her mood either. She had planned to get some errands done quickly, but the presence of the Royal Guard in her way was testing her patience. It seemed as though everyone around her was moving in slow motion, and she felt that the guard was just another obstacle. She walked closer to the guard, her eyes narrowing. With her child trailing behind her, she stopped in front of the soldier and began to speak in a loud voice, ensuring everyone could hear her complaints. "Why are you even standing there? This is ridiculous. You're just wasting everyone's time. What's the point of this whole charade?" she yelled. The Royal Guard remained unmoved, his gaze fixed straight ahead. This was a routine for him, standing at attention, unmoving, no matter how loud or rude the passerby was. It was his job, and he was trained to endure it. He wasn't supposed to respond, and he didn't. But Karen was not used to being ignored. It only made her angrier. "You're not even real soldiers. You don't protect anything. You're just standing there for show," she continued, her voice growing more irritated. She wasn't used to people not responding to her demands. It made her feel even more important to keep pushing the situation. But the soldier did not budge. His face was impassive, his stance unbroken. Karen's anger only deepened. She couldn't stand being dismissed like this. She looked around, searching for an outlet for her frustration. That's when she noticed something that made her feel like she had the upper hand. Her purse. Hidden inside was a small canister of pepper spray, something she carried for safety. But today it seemed like it could be her weapon of choice. With a quick, decisive motion, she reached into her purse, pulled out the canister, and pointed it at the guard's face. "If you won't listen to me, maybe this will get your attention," she thought to herself. Before the guard could even react, Karen sprayed the contents of the canister directly at him. The sharp hiss of the spray cut through the air, and the guard, shocked by the sudden assault, instinctively recoiled, though he didn't move from his position. His training kept him focused, but Karen, still standing there, felt a moment of satisfaction. She had done something that forced the guard to react, something that made her feel empowered. However, her sense of victory was short-lived. As soon as the pepper spray hit him, Karen began to feel a knot in her stomach. Her impulsive action had crossed a line, and the consequences of what she had just done were beginning to sink in. Her child, who had been watching in confusion, started to cry, sensing the tension. Karen's momentary triumph quickly turned to regret. She looked around, but the bystanders weren't cheering her on. Instead, they were staring at her in disbelief, some with their phones out, recording the incident. Karen's heart sank. She hadn't thought things through. Her frustration had led her to do something she might never be able to take back. As soon as Karen sprayed the pepper spray, a cold wave of shock swept over her. The guard, momentarily startled, flinched back, his eyes squinting as the sting of the pepper spray hit him. For a brief second, Karen felt a rush of satisfaction, believing she had finally forced the silent guard to react. But that feeling was fleeting. Almost instantly, she saw the error of her actions. The Royal Guard remained still, his composure not broken. His stoic expression never wavered, even though the spray had clearly affected him. Karen thought that perhaps he was about to break his silence, to shout at her or respond in some way. But instead, the guard remained calm, collecting himself, and his training kicked in. He slowly adjusted his stance, his hand moving slightly to wipe away the spray, his eyes now narrowing in concentration. Karen's heart began to pound in her chest as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She was no longer in control of the situation. In fact, she had just crossed a line that she couldn't take back. The crowd, which had been milling around just moments ago, was now staring at her in disbelief. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, some shaking their heads while others stepped back, uncertain of what would happen next. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, watching every move. Her child, still clutching her hand, looked up at her with confusion and fear. It wasn't just the guard who had been affected by her impulsive action. It was everyone around her. The reality of the situation was settling in. She had embarrassed herself in front of strangers, and now she was about to face the consequences. Then, within moments, the sound of approaching footsteps reached Karen's ears. At first it was slow, but soon more guards began to appear from nearby positions. The onlookers watched closely as the new arrivals, clearly not pleased with what had just happened, took control of the situation. Karen instinctively took a step back as the guards surrounded her, their expressions serious, their eyes stern. "Ma'am, you will need to come with us," one of the new guards said, his voice low but firm. His words carried an authority that Karen could not ignore. Her heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what was about to happen, but she knew it wasn't good. Karen's mind raced. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she was just frustrated, that she didn't mean for things to escalate this way. But deep down, she knew there was no excuse for what she had done. She had lost control in a public space, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The guard who had been sprayed stood tall and silent, his fellow soldiers surrounding him. He didn't speak to Karen, didn't offer any harsh words, but his silence spoke volumes. He was professional, maintaining his stance as though nothing had happened. However, the way the other guards were looking at Karen made it clear that her behavior had not gone unnoticed, and she would be held accountable. As Karen was escorted away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of shame wash over her. What had she expected? She had been so sure that the guard would react to her demands, but instead, she had provoked him without thinking of the consequences. Now, her careless outburst was causing more trouble than she had ever anticipated. She glanced at the faces around her, people who had been enjoying their day until now. They had witnessed a moment of poor judgment, and now she was the center of their attention. The embarrassment weighed heavily on her as she was led away, her child clinging to her side. The truth was undeniable. Karen had made a mistake, and it was one that she would not soon forget. Karen felt a heavy weight settle over her as she was escorted through the crowd by the guards. The once friendly atmosphere of the historic area now seemed cold and distant. The onlookers, who had been casually enjoying their day, were now eyeing her with disapproving glances. Some of them whispered to each other, their phones raised, recording the incident. Karen's cheeks burned with embarrassment, and her stomach churned. She had never imagined that her small act of defiance would turn into such a public spectacle. As she was led away from the guard post, she could hear the murmurs of the crowd growing louder. People were exchanging opinions, and the words she caught were not kind. She really went too far, one person said, shaking their head. What was she thinking? Another murmured. Karen wanted to say something, anything, to defend herself, but her voice seemed to have vanished. She was too overwhelmed by the shame to speak. Her child, still clinging to her side, had stopped crying, but the confusion on their face was obvious. They didn't understand what had just happened or why the guards were taking them away. Karen tried to offer a reassuring smile, but it felt forced, hollow. How could she explain this to her child? How could she explain why she had done something so impulsive, so out of character? The truth was, she didn't even understand why herself. In that moment of frustration, she had acted without thinking, and now she was paying the price. As the guards led her away from the scene, they stopped near a small holding area just out of sight from the public. The royal soldiers didn't speak much, but their eyes were sharp, observing her every move. Karen was quietly instructed to sit on a bench, her hands trembling as she tried to gather her thoughts. The cold realization of what she had done sank deeper with every passing second. She had pepper-sprayed a member of the Royal Guard. It wasn't just a random soldier. It was someone who had been standing guard, upholding the traditions and respect of the city. And now she had broken that respect. The guard who had been sprayed, standing a few feet away, hadn't said a word to her. He was simply standing in place, looking over her and the situation with a calm yet serious expression. Karen couldn't tell if he was angry or if he was simply waiting for the next step. His silence was deafening. She wanted to apologize, to say something that could somehow make things right, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. What could she say? I didn't mean it. There was no going back now. A few minutes later, an officer approached, his uniform more formal than the others. His face was stern, but there was no sign of fury in his eyes, only professionalism. "Ma'am, we need to ask you a few questions," he said in a calm, neutral tone. "You'll need to explain your actions, and we'll be investigating what happened here." Karen nodded silently, unable to bring herself to speak. She knew what was coming. The investigation, the questioning. It was all inevitable now. She had done something wrong, and there would be consequences. She just hoped, deep down, that the punishment wouldn't be as severe as it could be. As the officer spoke to her, Karen tried to clear her head. The events of the past few minutes felt like a blur, a series of poor decisions unfolding rapidly. She had been frustrated, yes, but no amount of frustration could justify what she had done. She had crossed a line, and now, as the officer patiently waited for her explanation, Karen found herself at a loss for words. There was nothing she could say to take back the mistake she had made. The air in the small holding area seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Karen's regret was all-consuming. If only she had stayed calm. If only she had walked away. But it was too late. Now, all she could do was face the consequences of her actions and hope she could somehow learn from this painful experience. The weight of the situation began to settle heavily on Karen as she sat there in the small holding area. The officer's calm demeanor did nothing to ease her anxiety. Her hands were still trembling, and the harsh reality of her actions played on repeat in her mind. She had sprayed a royal guard, someone who was simply doing his job, someone who was trained to stay calm no matter the provocation. And now she was facing the consequences of her rash decision. The officer who had spoken to her earlier left to speak with his colleagues, leaving Karen to stew in her thoughts. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one bringing more regret and fear. She couldn't help but replay the moment in her head over and over. Her anger, her frustration had led her to that impulsive action. But now, there was no turning back. She had acted in a way that no one could excuse. Her child, who had been so confused and frightened moments ago, had fallen silent beside her. The little one looked up at Karen with wide eyes, unsure of what had just happened or why they were sitting in this strange, uncomfortable place. Karen wanted to reach out and comfort her child, to tell them that everything would be okay. But in her heart, she knew that nothing would be the same after today. Her actions had not only affected her, but also her child. She could see it in their eyes. The fear, the confusion. And for that, she felt a deep pang of guilt. The officer returned shortly, followed by two other guards who seemed to carry a certain authority in their posture. They didn't speak much but exchanged looks that made Karen feel even more nervous. She wasn't sure if they were here to interrogate her or just to keep her under control, but the silence between them only made the tension worse. She didn't dare break it. One of the officers, a tall man with sharp features, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to explain why you acted the way you did. Assaulting a royal guard is a serious matter, and you need to understand the gravity of what's happened here." His voice was firm but not unkind. Karen's heart skipped a beat as she heard the words "serious matter." She had never once thought that her small act of defiance would lead to something this big. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. What could she say? How could she explain to these officers that she was just frustrated, that she didn't mean to take things this far. But those words didn't matter now. She had crossed a line, and she couldn't go back. After a few seconds of silence, Karen finally managed to find her voice, though it sounded weak and shaky. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was just frustrated. I didn't know what else to do. He wasn't responding to me, and I just lost my temper. I'm sorry." The officers looked at each other, their faces unreadable. They didn't immediately respond to her apology. Instead, they turned their attention to the guard who had been sprayed. He was standing nearby, still with his colleagues. Karen couldn't help but notice that his face remained stoic, unflinching. He didn't seem angry or upset, but rather detached, as though he had dealt with situations like this many times before. One of the officers spoke again, this time to the guard. "We'll need a report from you, sir. This is a serious issue." The guard nodded and began to write something down in a small notebook. Karen felt a wave of shame wash over her. She had caused this. This wasn't just about her frustration anymore. It was about the guard's well-being and the consequences of her actions. As she sat there, watching the officers make their notes, Karen realized that she had done something she couldn't take back. It wasn't just the guard she had hurt. It was the trust she had broken, the respect she had lost. And now, no matter what she said, there would be consequences. The legal process would take its course, and Karen would have to face whatever came next. For the first time in a long while, Karen truly felt the weight of her actions. There was no escaping the truth. What she had done had consequences far beyond her expectations. And now, she had to face them. Karen sat in the small holding area, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. The room was quiet except for the sound of her own thoughts echoing in her head. She had never imagined that her actions would lead to such a mess. What started as a moment of frustration had quickly spiraled out of control, and now she was stuck in a situation she didn't know how to fix. As the officers continued to speak in low tones, discussing the next steps, Karen found herself lost in thought. The reality of what she had done was starting to sink in more deeply. She had pepper sprayed a royal guard. Not only was that a serious offense, but it was also an act that could have lasting consequences. She had broken the law, and now it seemed there was no way to undo it. The officer who had first spoken to her returned to her side, his expression calm yet serious. "We've spoken with the guard you sprayed," he said, his voice firm but not unfriendly. "He's fine, but this incident is still being taken very seriously. Assaulting a member of the Royal Guard, especially in public, is a crime. We need to handle this according to the law." Karen nodded, the words sinking into her chest like a heavy weight. She had no defense. She had acted out of anger, out of frustration, but none of that could change the fact that she had made a huge mistake. She had broken the rules, and now she would have to face the consequences. As she sat there, her mind wandered back to the moments before the incident. She remembered the way the guard had stood there, silent and unmoving. He hadn't said a word, hadn't done anything to provoke her, but that's what had set her off, his silence. She had felt invisible, ignored, and in her frustration, she had lashed out. But now, as she thought about it more clearly, Karen realized that the guard hadn't been ignoring her. He had been doing his job, and in that moment, she had completely disregarded that. He had been trained to stand there without reacting, to keep his composure no matter what. And instead of respecting that, she had chosen to disrespect him and the role he played. The officer standing before her seemed to notice her deepening reflection. He spoke again, his voice slightly softer this time. "Ma'am, we understand that sometimes people act in the heat of the moment, but we also have to follow the law. This won't be a light matter. We need to make sure that this doesn't happen again." Karen swallowed hard, the truth of his words hitting her with full force. She couldn't just brush this off. It wasn't something she could apologize for and walk away from. There were real consequences to what she had done. The incident had been witnessed by many people, and it had already been captured on video by several bystanders. The footage was now circulating online, adding fuel to the fire. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how foolish her actions had been. "I never meant for it to go this far," Karen said, her voice trembling. She was trying to find the right words, but they didn't seem to matter anymore. I didn't know what else to do. I was angry, and I thought it would make a difference. But now, I see that I was wrong." The officer nodded, acknowledging her apology, but the seriousness of the situation didn't change. "We understand, but you'll need to go through the legal process. You'll have to answer for what happened here today. It's out of our hands now." Karen's heart sank as she realized the magnitude of the situation. She was now a part of a public spectacle, and there was no escaping it. The video of the incident would likely spread even further, with more people commenting and sharing their opinions. She would be judged for what she had done, and no amount of regret could undo it. The fear of how this would affect her reputation, her family, and her life weighed heavily on her. Her child, who had been sitting quietly by her side, looked up at her with wide eyes. Karen reached out, gently squeezing their hand, but there was no comfort she could offer. The damage had been done, and now it was time to face the consequences. There would be no going back from this moment, and Karen knew that she would have to live with the fallout. As Karen sat there, the minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. The officer had told her that the situation was out of their hands now, and she could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had hoped, deep down, that somehow everything would just go away, that the mess she had made would somehow disappear. But reality was much harsher. The situation was not going to fade away. The consequences were very real, and she would have to face them. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the day over and over. She had always prided herself on being able to handle situations with confidence, to speak her mind without hesitation. But this was different. This wasn't just a misstep, it was a full-on mistake. She had let her emotions take over, and now it had cost her more than she could have ever imagined. She thought about the guard, the same guard who had been standing so still, doing his job without reacting. He had been trained to deal with situations like hers, and yet here she was, sitting in a small holding room, facing serious consequences. He hadn't flinched, hadn't even reacted when she sprayed him. There was a strange kind of professionalism in his silence, something that made Karen feel even more foolish. What had she hoped to achieve? What had she expected? That he would react in anger, that he would shout at her. But he didn't. He had stood firm, calm, and unmoving. And now she was paying the price for her rash actions. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the officers returned to speak with her again. This time, he wasn't alone. Two others followed him into the room, each with a serious look on their faces. Karen's stomach twisted as she realized that this was only the beginning. The officers exchanged brief words before the officer who had been speaking to her earlier stepped forward. "We've reviewed everything," the officer said, his tone calm yet firm. "The video footage of the incident is already circulating. We need to make sure you understand the severity of this." Karen nodded silently, her heart sinking. The footage, the video, it had been captured by bystanders, and now it was spreading. She could already imagine the comments and reactions online, people sharing their opinions, judging her actions. The thought of her name being dragged through social media made her stomach churn. She wasn't just facing legal consequences now. She was facing public humiliation. "We'll be pressing charges for assault," the officer continued. "This is serious, and it will be handled accordingly." Karen felt the blood drain from her face. Assault. The word hung in the air like a heavy weight. She had never imagined it would come to this. The word sounded so harsh, so final. How had she ended up here? How had one moment of frustration led to something so dire? She had only meant to express her annoyance, but now she was in danger of facing serious legal consequences. The officer paused, allowing Karen a moment to process the information. She stared at her hands, which were still trembling slightly, and tried to gather her thoughts. She had no excuse for what she had done, no way to explain it away. She had let her anger get the best of her, and now she was going to pay the price. "We understand this was not your intention," the officer said, his voice softer now. "But we still need to go through the legal process. You'll have to answer for your actions." Karen nodded again, the weight of the situation settling deeper into her chest. She had no idea what to expect next, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. The officers would take their time with the investigation, and the legal process would follow. Her life, at least for the time being, was on hold. She would have to go through the motions, face the trial, the consequences, and try to rebuild from there. As the officers left the room, Karen was left alone with her thoughts. The silence was deafening. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She had been so sure of herself before, so certain that she could handle anything that came her way. But this was different. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of. There was no going back now. All she could do was face the consequences, hope for some mercy, and learn from the mistake she had made. Her child, who had been sitting quietly beside her, looked up at Karen again. They didn't say anything, but their eyes were filled with concern. Karen reached out and gave their hand a gentle squeeze, trying to offer some reassurance. But deep down, she knew that things would never be the same again. The mistake she had made today would follow her for a long time. The following days felt like a blur to Karen. She had always been someone who dealt with problems head-on, who thought she could talk her way out of anything. But now she found herself in a situation where words couldn't help her. She had made a mistake that couldn't be undone, and every passing hour seemed to drag on as the reality of the consequences set in. Her life, for the first time, felt completely out of control. The media was quick to pick up on the story. Within hours of the incident, the video of Karen spraying the Royal Guard had gone viral. It was everywhere, shared on social media platforms, picked up by news outlets, and even discussed on television. Karen had never been in the spotlight like this before, and she quickly realized that the attention wasn't flattering. People were harsh in their judgment, some criticizing her behavior, others laughing at the idea of her facing such serious consequences over a simple act of frustration. Karen tried to avoid the media frenzy, but it was impossible. The headlines followed her everywhere. Her name was now associated with a viral incident, and the weight of it seemed unbearable. The comment section was a constant reminder of her mistake, and no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the hurtful words cut deeper every time she read them. Even her family had begun to ask questions. She had to explain to them what happened, but how could she? How could she justify something so reckless? Her family, who had always known her as someone who could handle anything, was now seeing her in a completely new light. Her actions had not only affected her, but also hurt those who cared about her. They were disappointed, confused, and worried about what would happen next. Karen couldn't bear the thought of letting them down. As the days dragged on, Karen was forced to face the legal consequences of her actions. She was scheduled for a hearing to answer for what she had done. The guilt was overwhelming as she sat in the waiting room, anxiously glancing around at the others who were there for their own legal matters. Karen had never been in trouble with the law before, and the thought of facing the judge made her stomach churn. She tried to calm her nerves, but it wasn't easy. This was real. The consequences were real, and she was about to face them head-on. When her name was finally called, she stood up, her legs shaky. The room was filled with people, all watching her as she walked to the front. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the silent judgment of strangers. She had never felt so small in her life. As she sat before the judge, she couldn't help but think about the events that had led her here. The frustration, the anger, the impulsive decision, it had all led to this moment. The judge, a calm and professional woman, looked over her case, her eyes flicking from the papers in front of her to Karen. "Miss Karen," she began, her voice firm but not unkind. "This is a serious matter. You assaulted a member of the Royal Guard. This isn't something that can be overlooked. However, we will take into consideration your remorse and the fact that this was an impulsive action rather than premeditated." Karen nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, but no words came. The regret she felt was so strong that it threatened to swallow her whole. She had no excuse for what she had done. She couldn't go back and change it, but all she could do was show the judge that she understood the gravity of her actions and that she was willing to accept responsibility for them. The judge spoke again, this time offering a resolution. "Given the circumstances, I am sentencing you to a fine, as well as community service. You will also be required to take part in anger management counseling, as we believe this incident was driven by a momentary lapse in judgment. You will be given a chance to make amends for your actions." Karen breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't an easy sentence, but it could have been worse. At least she wouldn't face jail time. She left the courtroom feeling a mix of relief and shame. The punishment was fair, and she knew it, but it was hard to shake the feeling that she would never be able to fully erase the memory of what had happened. As she left the courthouse, Karen couldn't help but think about what this all meant for her future. She had made a mistake, and now she would have to live with the consequences. But in a strange way, she also felt like she had been given a second chance. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least she had the opportunity to rebuild. She couldn't change the past, but she could work hard to make sure she never made the same mistake again. Karen took a deep breath, knowing that this was just the beginning. The next chapter of her life was waiting, and she was determined to face it with humility and a renewed sense. Karen's life in the weeks following the court hearing felt like a slow, steady climb back from the edge. The legal consequences of her actions were still fresh in her mind, but she was doing her best to adjust and move forward. The fine she had been ordered to pay was hefty, and the community service was something she had to take seriously. But it was the anger management counseling that felt like the real challenge. She had never thought of herself as someone with a temper, but after everything that had happened, Karen realized how much she had underestimated the impact of her emotions on her decisions. At first, the community service felt like a punishment. Karen was assigned to help at a local shelter for the homeless, and every day she would spend hours cleaning, sorting through donations, and organizing food. The work was hard, and the people she met were often struggling with their own challenges, but something about it made her feel like she was starting to make a difference. Slowly, Karen began to realize that there was something valuable in this experience, something that went beyond just paying the price for her mistake. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes of clothes at the shelter, Karen spoke to one of the regular volunteers. The woman, a kind-hearted soul who had been helping at the shelter for years, shared her own story of how she had come to volunteer. She had once made a mistake, something that had hurt others deeply, and had spent years trying to make amends. Listening to the woman's story, Karen was struck by how much the volunteer had grown through her own challenges. It was clear that, like Karen, this woman had once been at a crossroads in her life, faced with a choice between accepting responsibility for her actions and allowing herself to be defined by her mistakes. That conversation was a turning point for Karen. She realized that even though she had made a big mistake, it didn't have to define her forever. She could learn from it, grow from it, and use it to make a positive impact in her life and the lives of others. Slowly, she began to see her community service as a way to rebuild, not just to erase her mistake, but to build something new. Her counseling sessions, which had started off feeling like a chore, also began to open her eyes to the deeper issues that had contributed to her impulsive actions. The therapist she saw was kind but firm, helping Karen uncover the sources of her frustration. Over the course of the sessions, Karen realized that her anger had been building for months, small frustrations that she had ignored, mounting stress, and a feeling of being overwhelmed. Her outburst at the Royal Guard had been the breaking point, but it wasn't the root cause of her problems. The sessions helped her see that her anger was often a mask for her deeper feelings of inadequacy and fear. Karen had never been one to show vulnerability, but during these sessions, she learned how to open up and face the parts of herself she had been avoiding. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she wanted to walk away, when the pain of confronting her own flaws felt too much to bear. But with each session, Karen felt herself becoming stronger. She was beginning to take control of her life again, no longer letting her emotions control her actions. As the weeks passed, Karen's outlook began to change. She completed her community service hours with a sense of accomplishment, and the counseling session slowly started to become a place of healing rather than a reminder of her mistake. She even began to feel proud of the work she was doing at the shelter, seeing the positive impact she was making on the lives of others who were struggling. By the time her sentence was over, Karen had transformed in ways she hadn't expected. She was no longer just the woman who had pepper-sprayed a royal guard. She was someone who had faced her mistakes, learned from them, and used the experience to grow. The road hadn't been easy, but it had been worthwhile. Looking back on everything, Karen realized that the moment she had feared most, the moment she had thought would break her, had turned out to be the moment that changed her life for the better. She had been given the opportunity to rebuild, to become a stronger, more self-aware person, and for the first time in a long while, Karen felt like she was truly on the right path. Though she could never forget what had happened, Karen knew that her future was not defined by her mistake. It was defined by the lessons she had learned and the woman she was becoming. She had made a mistake, but she was no longer a prisoner of it. Instead, she was moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to live her life with more patience, understanding, and respect for others, and most importantly, for herself.